Good afternoon and good evening to the approximately 400 people registered today from around the world. This is the third of the six-part series that American Jewish University and the Middle East Forum have been presenting each Monday on the impact of Islamic radicalism on America academia, politics, elections, and media. Today we mark 1 year in the war that Hamas initiated on October 7th with a huge barbaric massacre, that Hezbollah joined on October 8th, and that has had attacks from Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, and two massive missile attacks by Iran on a state the size of New Jersey. The IDF has counted 26,000 missiles and drones fired against Israel over the past year. That's an average of nearly 100 every day. Israel's survival and its astounding recent victories against both Hamas and Hezbollah in an existential war that has 7 fronts has been nothing short of miraculous. But Hezbollah and Hamas have been decapitated but not destroyed. Iran has so far paid no price for the barbaric war it is directing, and we are in the middle of an ongoing story. As someone has said, today's date is not October 7th, but October 365 and counting. How and when this war will end, we do not know, but what we do know is this: how Israel has and will continue to respond will define it for decades, and the same is true for the United States, and the same is true for the international community. This is a story that goes from the individual to the global. It's a story about 100 individuals still held for a year under barbaric conditions by a barbaric enemy, and it's a story about an international order that is being challenged by a tyrannical, totalitarian regime that explicitly promises death not only to Israel but to America, and is proceeding virtually unopposed toward nuclear weapons in its efforts to do so. So today is a time not simply to commemorate what happened a year ago, but to understand what's happening today and to think about what to do tomorrow. We have with us two distinguished experts to talk about October 7th, then, now, and tomorrow. GREGG Roman is the director of the Middle East Forum. He previously served as political advisor to Israel's deputy foreign minister and worked for the Israeli Ministry of Defense. He's written articles over the past year reporting on what's been happening in Israel and what Israelis expect from their government now. Jonathan Spire is director of research at the Middle East Forum and editor of the Middle East Quarterly. He had a remarkable op-ed in the Wall Street Journal over the weekend on the liberation of a Yazidi woman held in Gaza hostage for a decade. That article is a must-read, and we'll put a link to it up in the chat function. So let me start by asking each of our experts to give us their thoughts about what happened last October 7th, what's happening on this one, and where they think all this is headed. Jonathan, let's start with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, given that your title of the series is to do with Islamic radicalism, I think it's maybe a good place to start by placing October 7th in that context. And that's not just a theoretical task, but actually, I think, brings us to a lot of the reality of what has happened. Because as I see it, at least, we can divide the war, the last year, really into three phases in a certain sense. That in the first phase, Israel was at war with Hamas. In the second phase, Israel was at war with Hamas plus Iran's proxies. And in the third phase, which may still be about to open up, Israel is going to be facing Iran itself. And from this point of view, I would say the first part, where Israel was solely at war with Hamas, lasted exactly 1 day, and that day was October 7th. What do I mean by that? October 7th was, to my mind, and I've covered Sunni Islamic radicalism in the Middle East for the best part of 2 decades, up close and on the front line on many occasions. October 7th was a Sunni jihadi event par excellence. And what I mean by that is that in all its particulars, it resembled Sunni Islamist and Sunni jihadi rampages that we can name that have taken place in the Levant and in Iraq over the last decade and a half to 2 decades. As an obvious example, I personally witnessed the advance of Islamic State across the Nineveh plains in the summer of 2014, and I was close up to their attempt to genocide the Yazidi people, who you mentioned, Rick, in regard to my recent op-ed. In all particulars, Hamas's attack on October 7th resembled those earlier examples. That's to say, in terms of the mass killings of civilians, in terms of the instances of rape, in terms of the taking of slaves, all down to the tactical particulars, if I can dignify them with such a term. This is a Sunni jihadi event par excellence. What was shocking about it was that Israel had spent decades building a structure so that Israelis would never need to experience that. And these structures, shockingly, of course, failed on October 7th, with the result that the region, in all its horror, so to speak, came flooding through into Israel through the portal of the Gaza Strip for a day until it was sealed again at the end of October 7th. October 7th then was a Sunni jihadi event par excellence, but October 8th and all the days subsequently was something else. They were the mobilization, partial but telling, of the Iran-led regional alliance. It's worth noting, by the way, Rick and the listeners, that Hamas is something of an anomaly in this sense. It straddles two worlds. It's a Sunni jihadi organization, Islamist organization, like Daesh, like Jabhat al-Nusra, like the others. But unlike them, it also belongs to a Shia-led power bloc. And it was that bloc that mobilized in part from October 8th in its defense. As you mentioned, first of all in Lebanon, then from November with the mobilization of the Ansar Allah, the Houthis movement against shipping in the Gulf of Aden, Red Sea area, and then, of course, the Iraqi Shia militias and those in Syria too. And finally, from April onwards, and then once again last week, Iran itself on 2 occasions mobilizing in defense of its beleaguered client. So 2 separate wars in a certain sense. I would like to, I guess, just finish. I mean, I want to go on and on, but I would like to ask the question then, where do we stand a year after October 7th? How is the war going? Are we advancing? Are we retreating? A couple of points on this. First of all, Israelis have a great deal to be proud of in terms of the performance of their armed forces. And by this, in saying this, I don't only or even primarily mean the remarkable achievements that you mentioned of recent weeks, the killing of Nasrallah, the killing of Hashem Safiuddin, the exploding pagers, the exploding walkie-talkies. I don't even mean that. That's, of course, remarkable in and of itself. I mean something else. The performance of the big army, which Israelis were much less sure about, has been extremely impressive. And the first task set Israel on October 7th, namely the destruction of the Hamas military capacity in the Gaza Strip, the destruction of the very entity that carried out October 7th, is largely completed. Not completely, but largely completed. The Hamas conventional military capacity in the Gaza Strip has more or less ceased to exist. Guerrilla resistance, sporadic guerrilla resistance remains, but the major part of that task has been achieved. The main task, or the next main task facing Israel is, of course, in Lebanon. I was up on the Lebanese border 2 days ago trying to witness the current ground operation. The achievements, as you mentioned, further inland into Lebanon, so to speak, have been remarkable on the intelligence field. When it comes to the conventional military field, I think a major question mark still remains as to what exactly Israel is trying to do and how exactly it's going to achieve it. The stated goal is the return of 60,000 Israeli internal refugees to their homes. It's not clear yet how Israel intends to achieve that. There are tactical gains going on against Hezbollah villages close to the border. How you translate that into Israel's stated goal remains, for me, something of a question mark still. And of course, and I guess lastly, just in terms of this whistle-stop introduction, at least to where we currently stand, Israel's retaliation for the Iranian ballistic missile attack of last week is, it would appear, all the signs are there, coming quite soon. We don't know what the dimensions of that attack will be, but it's very possible that we are step by step heading into something much bigger than we could have possibly envisaged on the day of October 7th, in a certain sense. That's to say, we may well be in the foothills of a war of Israel, and maybe even its allies too, against the Islamic Republic of Iran. I should conclude with these initial remarks with two points, two related points. Firstly, this is a war which is going to come, I think, at a certain point. Maybe it's not going to be now. Maybe it will be some years hence. But there isn't going to be a Middle East in which a flourishing Jewish state of Israel and the Islamic Republic of Iran and its proxies coexist over a long period of time. One or other of those is going to go. We intend that it's not going to be us, of course, but one or other of those is going to go. So this is a war which is written in history, so written in history's pages, so to speak. It's bound to come. This is firstly. And the second point I would like to register, so to speak, because it's my view and it's also the view of Middle East Forum, and something which we are doing our best to introduce into the ether of the discussion, if I can put it that way, is that the goal of Israel and the goal of its Western allies too needs to be that the Islamic Republic of Iran, that the Islamist regime in Iran should cease to exist, that regime should fall. That is the only strategic goal, in my view, worthy of the dimensions of the challenge and worthy of the dimensions of the sacrifices which both Israeli and other young people are being called upon to make. The way that this thing gets solved is not only the destruction of the Islamist proxy statelets that Iran established to Israel's south and to its north in the Gaza Strip and in Lebanon, but it must also be eventually the strategic goal of the Islamic Republic of Iran ceasing to exist. And in so doing, that the long challenge of political Islam that political Islam has been issuing to the Middle East over the last decades now, over the last half century even, will be brought to a successful conclusion by its enemies. And we're into those historic dimensions right now. The trigger of them was October 7th. In all its tragedy, in many ways, it may be remembered to history as something like, you remember that World War I was triggered by an assassination down in the town of Sarajevo in Bosnia by a Serbian nationalist. No one thought that had global dimensions, but by activating and triggering alliance systems, it took on eventually enormous dimensions. We may well be experiencing, in a very different particulars, of course, a similar dynamic and process. So I'll leave it there in terms of a few opening remarks, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Jonathan. Greg, do you want to weigh in with either your thoughts on these questions or response to what Jonathan has said?
I want to first thank American Jewish University for allowing us at the Middle East Forum to bring our perspectives, some of our guests, our analysts, staff, and fellows to this discussion, and to be able to have this very important talk today for your audience, for your followers, your subscribers, and your listeners. And I'd like to extend some thoughts based off of what Jonathan had said, and to move the conversation in a direction where we don't just see the threats that Israel is facing outward of its borders, and also the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, the West Bank, Iran, but also to some of the challenges that the country has experienced over the past year internally, and also to offer a few thoughts on the U.S.-Israel relationship and where it stands now, 365 days after October 7th, 2023. First, before I got on this webinar, I had the opportunity to view part of Israel's National Remembrance Ceremony, which is now taking place, with songs, stories of grief, mourning, stories of the victims and what their families have been through for the past year. But not just those who fell on October 7th, also the stories of soldiers, some 540,000 of whom were mobilized in addition to the 180,000 standing Israeli army, more than 700 of whom have fallen in the last year, not just in Gaza, but also now in Lebanon. And I thought to myself, if Israel was able to rally, to be able to survive for this long, they have an economy which is coming under increasing pressure by its neighbors, the total blockade of the Turkish economy, where Israel was a major trading partner, the increasing challenges to Israel's currency, the massive hits that Israeli businesses, so some 60,000 of whom some small businesses have shut down over the past year. these are no less a challenge than being able to kinetically respond to Iran, Hamas, and Hezbollah. There must be the fortitude on the home front to be able to deal with all of these grave dangers which are posed to the Israeli economy. But it has been because of support from the United States, from some of Israel's Western allies, and increasingly some of the Sunni Arab states that entered into the Abraham Accords some 4 or 5 years ago when the Trump administration was in power, and which were strengthened through the Negev Forum over the past 3 or 4 years, where we see signs of hope. There are now investment opportunities which are taking place for companies to be able to continue their initial public offerings, to be able to buy up Israeli intellectual property. You hear stories of soldiers who fight in Gaza during the day and answer emails from the Qasba of Gaza City at night. The Israeli resilience, both in the army and both the family members, whether it be women and children, husbands to women soldiers who are serving as officers on the front line, and even their extended families are coming in day out. And even very close to my home, where we now have members of my family, my extended family, serving in Lebanon. There is not one Israeli who will tell you they have not been touched by this war, whether it has been because of an impact on their job, their business, or knowing someone who has served, whether it be in the field or in a reserve unit back at home. And when you think how this touches every Israeli, when you think how it touches every single person who is now watching that state memorial ceremony, you can't help but also think to extend how the American Jewish community has responded to this war, to this struggle that Israel is now facing, whether it be a discussion over the Rosh Hashanah table, which took place last week, on which presidential candidate might be better for the Jewish state, over whether it's looking at statements being made by individuals who have an opinion anathema of the close proximity of the U.S.-Israel relationship, or whether it's just extending to their daily thoughts when they're going through their phones, reading the news in the morning to see what's happening in the Holy Land. Every single American Jew has been touched by this, and not just American Jewry, but global Jewry. And the fact that DHS and the FBI had to issue a warning this morning saying that today, October 7th, was not just a day for the United States to join Israel in commemorating the horrific nature of this event and mourning those who were lost, but that Jewish institutions had to be on high alert in case there might be any copycat attacks or Hamas-inspired attacks due to active intelligence which said that something might be coming down the pike. Now, I don't really think anything is going to happen because the American Jewish community is at a heightened state of alert. But as much as Israelis are fighting their war on 7 fronts, the global Jewish diaspora is also facing their own sense of danger and starting to question their place in Western liberal democracies, many of whom in Europe, and some political parties in the United States who are starting to question and challenge and really share, in some cases, anti-Semitic beliefs as it relates to the U.S.-Israel relationship. So I think, Rick, just in a closing thought, it's important to focus on the battlefield, but it's also important to focus on the war at home, both for Israelis who are not actively engaged in the war effort but can still feel it, and also for members of Jewish diaspora communities who have seen the war come to their doorstep, not in perhaps the form of tanks and guns and bullets, but in terms of the conversations and the feelings they have every day when they go to work, when they're around the dinner table, or when they're thinking about this as they're reading the stories coming out of the region.
Okay, thank you, Greg. Since we only have 30 minutes, I think I'm going to jump to probably the most important question on the table today, and that's what to do about Iran. I want to ask each of you, it seems to me there's 3 aspects of it. What should Israel's response be? Should it be proportionate, to use President Biden's term? Should it be disproportionate? And if so, what would be disproportionate? And would the United States, however you answer that, join in a response or simply leave it to Israel and concentrate on defense? So please, each of you, give us your thoughts about what to do about Iran today, as opposed to long-term in the future. Jonathan, why don't we start with you?
Okay. Well, first of all, I think that it's very, very important that this response be a determined one. In the first occasion after April 13th, Israel basically allowed itself, I think, to receive counsel from its American ally and to carry out and to take the win, as President Biden called it, regarding the successful mobilization of air defenses over the region on the night of April 13th, and therefore to carry out a very, very minor response indeed, which really was just saying to the Iranians, hey, look, this is showing you how much more we could do if we really wanted to. Not saying that was necessarily a wrong thing to do at that time. That's all history now. That must not happen again. It's not possible for a country to be attacked twice by ballistic missiles and not respond properly, because at least in our neighborhood, what that would do if you respond again insufficiently is that then becomes a norm. That rapidly becomes baked into a power norm. Now we'll know that every time Israel does something significant against Hamas or against Hezbollah, Israel just has to put up with 80 ballistic missiles flying at it, because that's just part of the way things run. Well, no, that can't be the way things run. Israel must therefore respond with sufficient strength, either to deter the Iranians so that they don't try it again, or unfortunately, built into that situation is the possibility of escalation. Israel must not be afraid to escalate if necessary. Being afraid to escalate will end up in the ongoing gradual deterioration of Israel's strategic position. So Israel must respond disproportionately and strongly in order to either deter the Iranians or to escalate, and not to be afraid of the possibility of escalation. What would that mean in practice? Well, we have a number of different areas of possible targeting. The nuclear program is one, the oil installations and ports, Bandar Abbas, Khargil, and these kind of places is a second. And a third, which I think is an interesting one, at least from my point of view of my thoughts, which is regime symbols and military installations specifically connected to the governance of Islamic Republic of Iran. It would seem to me that that may well be the direction that Israel might be looking, because of the complexities of hitting oil installations in terms of the global economic knock-on effect, and because of the issue of the nuclear program, at least at the moment being a little bit too sensitive at the present time. So we'll see. But those seem to me to be three areas. It's vital that Israel respond disproportionately. It is vital also, just to conclude this, that with regard to the proxies of Iran, who I've been looking at quite closely for a number of years, that action against them take place as well. It is astonishing that the Houthis have managed to close down to a rate of 90% of commercial shipping going through the Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea since the end of 2023. And that has to end too. And that can only end through a determined response, not only by Israel, but also by the custodians of global waterways, which means the United States and the British and the French and those allies too. So it's can't only be Israel's job to take on the Iranian challenge, because the Iranian challenge encompasses dimensions vastly beyond those of the Jewish state in the Middle East. The challenge is a much bigger one. So those are a few thoughts from me.
Greg, you've been taking the temperature of the Israeli populace. You've been reporting on what they want from their government. Do you have thoughts on what the majority of Israelis believe the government should do at this time with respect to Iran?
I think you have to bifurcate the Iran issue from that of trying to obtain a ceasefire in Gaza to be able to try and have some sort of deal for the hostages. I think if you ask an Israeli in the bottom of the depths of his soul, if he thinks that's possible, I think that right now with what's happening with this escalation that Jonathan is speaking about, is that it's almost near impossible to get a deal. So if you put that on the side and you focus solely on Iran, Israelis realize that now is the time to give Iran a knockout blow, which is what I think they would be calling for. Whether the policymakers in Jerusalem and the politicians in the security cabinet who will make that decision, who have, as Jonathan alluded to, counsel from the United States, including a visit by the head of Central Command just yesterday, and whether they will take that knockout blow, I don't know if they necessarily will go all the way. But I think that the Israeli people realize that now is not just the time to give a disproportionate, unequivocally smashing attack on Iran, whether it be its oil facilities, its nuclear program, or its military installations. But now is the time for the Israeli people to back a much longer play that Jonathan touched on earlier, which is setting a strategic goal for the government of Israel to overthrow the Islamic Republic of Iran, not necessarily through boots on the ground or through sole military force, but to support proxies who are as much aligned against Iran as Israel is today. And I think that the Israeli people will do anything that its government asks them to do to be able to support such a non-kinetic option or a revolution by proxy option should it come to that.
So to return to the question of a ceasefire, which, as you say, is not on the table now, but seems to be the objective of the United States government. The ceasefires in the past, there have been ones. There was one on October 6th, before October 7th. They have, in the past, both in Gaza and in Lebanon, turned into periods to prepare for the next war, rather than a solution to any of the problems that generate it. My question to both of you is there a necessity for a no man's land in both northern Gaza and southern Lebanon? Not one necessarily with Israeli boots on the ground, but one that's declared either by Israel itself or in connection with the United States or in connection with the international community, in order to ensure that forces hostile to Israel cannot be put in place to do this again.
Well, I would say, first of all, with regard to Gaza, the answer is yes. I mean, that's to say, I think that Israel needs to be present in the Philadelphia corridor, and it needs also to maintain the Netzarim corridor, and it needs also to have that buffer zone of 3 or 4 kilometers that it's been building along the east-west border of Gaza. But I would say it goes beyond that. I think that a condition of the conclusion of this war and the conclusion of a ceasefire has to be the future nature of Gaza governance itself. Because what Hamas has been insisting on in terms of the conditions that it set for a ceasefire, which include, of course, the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, is basically the survival of Hamas governance in Gaza. That's Hamas's interest in having a ceasefire. There's no point in having a ceasefire if it ceases to exist as the governing force. And that's a major stumbling block to any ceasefire, because Israel cannot, of course, accept at any price, so to speak, the continuation of Hamas governance in Gaza. So I think, yes, it's a buffer zone, but it's beyond that with regard to the Gaza Strip. With regard to Lebanon, if we really want to rebuild northern communities, and again, we've all spent time, I think, on the northern border. We know that, Hezbollah fighters were literally meters away from children's houses, children's educational institutions in northern border communities. If we want to bring those people back, it cannot be done if Hezbollah simply redeploys all the way to the border fence, all the way to the blue line and the border fence, which means, one way or another, there has to be some kind of empty zone, some kind of zone, a buffer zone in between the Israeli population and Lebanon and the Hezbollah forces in Lebanon. Since Hezbollah is clearly not going to be destroyed in the current war, it doesn't look like it is, they have to be pushed back. Whether that means boots on the ground going all the way to the Litani or some other type of idea is yet to be discussed, and we need to discuss it. As of now, at least, I'm not quite sure what the current Israeli dimensions of operation are supposed to achieve. Much less is going on, actually, that's been my impression, than we're told about. Usually we say more is going on. This is in terms of the dimensions and depth of Israeli activity so far across the border. Actually, much less is going on compared to the huge fanfare in the global media, where it said Israel invades Lebanon a few days ago. So yes, there does need to be a buffer zone there too, and we need to think very carefully about how exactly to get that built on the ground or established on the ground.
Well, this obviously could take us more than the 30 minutes we've got today, so it'll be a subject that we're returning to. I guess I would mention to our audience a couple things. One is to be sure to read Jonathan Spyer's op-ed from this weekend's Wall Street Journal. Also to go to the Middle East Forum website, because they have put up today a whole series of important articles that bear reading or rereading on this October 7th. So I want to thank both of the experts from the Middle East Forum, thank the Middle East Forum for what it is doing, and encourage all of you to return next Monday and the one after that to join us again for a discussion of this continuing topic. So thank you all, and have a good day.